Welcome to Variations 4. This is the gastrointestinal accessory organs unit. In this chapter, or rather video, we'll be covering questions 1 to 5 as we start to begin our look at acute hepatitis. So what's the definition of hepatitis? Pretty simple: inflammation of the liver. What are some of its causes? There are a number of them. If you look at your maps here, you can see them listed up here in map number 1. Those can all cause the liver to become inflamed. Okay, and then question number 2, what's the etiology of each one of these things? A, B, and C, Hep A, B, and C. Hep A is essentially poor hygiene and crowding. Fecal to mouth, you touch dirty water with fecal content in it. Someone touches your food they're cooking and they have fecal content on their hands because they didn't wash their hands properly. Poor sanitation systems, as you may find in some countries. Basically, it ends up being orally ingested. The fecal content can cause Hep A, or can spread to Hep A, rather. Luckily, we have our Hep A and B vaccines that we take, and we've hopefully had them by this time in our life. We don't have to worry about Hep A if we've had the vaccine already. Hep B is body and blood fluid exposure, and there's many ways for that to happen. Blood, body fluid exposure. Hep B, if you do get it, can increase the risk of liver cancer and has a great risk for chronic hepatitis. Eventually, Hep A will clear and go away. Hep B has a pretty good chance of becoming chronic, can become chronic. Again, something we don't really have to worry about if we've had our vaccines for A and B. At this point, Hep C, there's no known vaccine, but there is meds that people have reported to have taken antivirals and cleared the Hep C from their body. Nonetheless, for a lot of people, and up to now, it's really being considered a chronic virus. But as I said, there's increasing numbers of cases of people who have cleared it with meds. Blood exposure is how you get it. There again, can lead to long-term liver damage, increases your chance of cancer. The next question asks us to look at the basic pathophysiology of hepatitis. In fact, specifically some of the signs and symptoms of acute hepatitis. Fairly non-specific here. You've got an inflammatory response associated with liver cell damage. You get death of the liver cells called hepatocytes. And as you know, all that activity causes inflammation. And as we talked about with inflammation, inflammation causes fibrotic tissue, can cause scarring, causes cells that used to work to be ineffective anymore. Scarred tissue can't do the job. Now, we visited this when we talked about the gastrointestinal unit, and we talked about fibrotic formation in the GI lumen, talked about how peristalsis couldn't happen there. We also talked about how it narrows the lumen and can lead to obstruction. Well, it's the same with inflammation anywhere. When you've got this fibrotic tissue happening, scarring happening, cells can't do their job, therefore the organ itself stops doing its functions if the scarring's bad enough. And also you get pressure from the scarring around certain areas, like the bile ducts. So you get this inflammation in the periportal region. This can lead to hypertension. Why? Because you've got inflammation, you've got scarring, you've got increased pressure against vessels, and you can get hypertension in that area. We'll talk more about that later. You can get pressure from the scarring around the bile duct, and therefore bile can't drain from the liver into the gallbladder properly. So bile flow is not happening properly. Okay. Here's some of the symptoms. I mean, fairly non-specific. You'd have to get a history, a background, do some blood tests to figure out if they had the virus. But you can see that here's a list of symptoms people may have early on. They don't have to have all of them, but they could have some of them. And you can look some of those up if you don't know what they are. All right, so I believe the next question is asking us about bilirubin. What is the difference between conjugated and unconjugated bilirubin? How does this relate to jaundice? Looking at map 3 for that, for question number 4. So if we look at map number 3, first of all, we know that when red blood cells are destroyed, they release bilirubin. Now, this is a normal part of the bodily process of regenerating and turnover of red blood cells. So when this bilirubin first enters the system from the lysed RBC, it's what's called unconjugated. And what that means is, in a nutshell, it can't be excreted by the kidney. It has to pass through the liver first. The liver processes it in such a way that it becomes conjugated. And what that means is it's able to be renally excreted. So that's the difference between conjugated and unconjugated. How does that relate to jaundice? Well, if you have liver failure, like very bad liver viral infection, and it's caused a lot of scarring or inflammation, and the liver is not doing its job, then the bilirubin is not able to be processed by the liver. It remains unconjugated. It remains in the blood flow. It can't be excreted. And as long as the liver is in that condition, the person may have signs of jaundice. How could you end up with conjugated bilirubin in the bloodstream? You could have a blockage at the bile duct. So the liver is able to process some of the bilirubin, but the bile duct is either got too much pressure around it and it's not, or blocked in some way, and it's not able to allow that bilirubin to empty into the gallbladder. And so it ends up backing up into the system, and before you know it, it's in the bloodstream. But the big difference between conjugated and unconjugated is eventually that conjugated, even if it's in the bloodstream, will end up being excreted by the kidneys. But it could, before that point, lead to some jaundice. The question number 4 also wanted us to look at some more signs and symptoms and just talk a little bit more about acute hepatitis with this map here. And so, yeah, I mean, we get some more symptoms here in the triangle, signs and symptoms. Obviously, if you think about all the functions of the liver, then these start to make sense. Your clotting factors, your coagulation factors go down because the liver produces coagulation factors. If we assume the liver's got bad enough damage that it can't produce coagulation factors, then our bleeding times go up. We're at risk for bleeding. Liver enzymes. So GGT, AST, ALT, you don't need to know what each one stands for, but they're different enzymes that are released whenever there's damage to liver cells. Just as the heart releases troponin when it's damaged, the liver cells release these liver enzymes, GGT, AST, ALT, when they're damaged. And so you'd see that in the blood work. They may not be too hungry. They may feel nauseated. They may have that discomfort in that at the right upper quadrant. And albumin may be down because, again, that's one of the liver's responsibilities, is to synthesize albumin, which is our major oncotic player in the vascular space. These are all pretty significant signs and symptoms that can lead to other problems. Now, we've talked about this part down here already. Okay, so some of the things we could do is increase your, this diet, but you want to decrease fat because they haven't got the bile going into the small intestine. So, until that gets solved, you may want to take it easy on the fat. Protein, you got to be careful with. We're going to talk later about that, why that's a problem for someone with liver failure, acute liver virus. And alcohol, obviously, we got to be careful with that too, because that's what the liver is responsible for metabolizing as well. I believe that brings us to question number 5. which is asking us to look at the optimal diet. I think we've actually covered this one. The diet we just talked about, PTINR, bilirubin, plus rest. Okay. So PTINR are the first blood coagulation markers to be affected. PTT will eventually be affected as well. It takes about 2 months before you can detect the hepatitis antigens and antibodies. So you could quite possibly have hepatitis and not get confirmation via blood work. You may have to wait a couple of months before you can get that.